We're now waiting to bring up the Secretary so that we can see him.
I'm here, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Before I make my opening remarks, Mr. Secretary, thank you, number one, for being here. And this is the importance, given this topic and the importance of this topic and this committee's constitutional responsibility of oversight, I wanted to ask you whether or not you would be willing to stay to answer all member questions. We want all members to have the opportunity, knowing that this is the first time that we're having some testimony in regards to pulling out since the August 31st of this year. Would you have the ability to stay to answer all members' questions?
Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to stay until every member's had an opportunity to ask a question. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We thank you for that. And I see that we have a quorum, and I now will recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to evaluate the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan and the series of policies from the past 20 years that led to the events of August 2021. Mr. Secretary, it is good to have you back here before our committee a third time since you've been Secretary. And thank you, and we appreciate your recognition of the important role this legislative body plays in conducting oversight on the executive. And I want to start off today by citing some numbers. 800,000. That's the number of Americans who served with the U.S. military in Afghanistan since 2001. 2,461. That's the number of American military personnel who died in Afghanistan, including the 13 brave Americans who were killed facilitating the evacuation of 124,000 people over the course of 17 days. 66,000, the number of Afghan national security forces killed in the conflict. 47,245, that's the number of Afghan civilians killed since 2001. 20, that's the number of years we have been fighting in Afghanistan. A war that has gone on for almost 20 years is a disaster. Disentangling ourselves from the war in Afghanistan was never going to be easy. And for my friends who presume a clean solution for the withdrawal existed, I would welcome hearing what exactly a smooth withdrawal from a messy, chaotic 20-year war looks like. In fact, I've yet to hear the clean withdrawal option because I don't believe one exists. Now, are there things the administration could have done differently? Absolutely yes, as always. Foremost for me is for the State Department to evaluate how it could better evacuate Americans when events unravel quickly. And I look forward to hearing from the Secretary how the State Department intends to complete its evacuation of the 100 to 200 Americans remaining in Afghanistan who want to come home, as well as for evacuating those Afghans who worked alongside us during the past 20 years. However, it is important to separate fair criticism from criticism that isn't made in good faith and divorced from the realities on the ground in Afghanistan. We've heard some criticize the decision to close Bagram, which they claim would have been better suited for evacuations, as though it would have been easier to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people from an airfield 40 miles outside of Kabul. Others criticize the decision to not keep a small counterterrorism force in the country. I ask, where was this protest when the Trump administration sidelined the Afghan government in order to cut a deal with the Taliban? Where was the protest when the Trump administration negotiated a deal with the Taliban just 1 month after the abduction of Navy veteran Mark Freyricks. And where was this protest when then President Trump and Secretary Pompeo agreed to withdraw all troops by May 21st, 2020? And let me remind everyone that Trump's deal forced the Afghan government to release 5,000 prisoners and offered international legitimacy to the Taliban. It was a deal that failed to require the Taliban to separate from al-Qaeda terrorists and did not require the Taliban to stop attacking the Afghan government. The deal altered the political order of the country. Now, some may say Trump's agreement was conditions-based, but it was different, that it came with stronger conditions. But that's simply not true. The choice before President Biden was between a full withdrawal and the surging of thousands of Americans to Afghanistan for an undefined time. To argue that there was a third option, a limited troop presence where the safety of our personnel could be preserved, in my mind, is a fantasy. Had we not removed American troops from Afghanistan, we would have left them in the middle of a rapidly deteriorating war zone with no assurances that they would be spared by the Taliban. And it strikes me that many of those critical of the administration's evacuation efforts are really just angry that the president made good on his pledge to end America's involvement in the war in Afghanistan. They are masking their displeasure with criticism but fail to offer feasible alternatives. Once again, we are seeing domestic politics injected into foreign policy. The Taliban's quick takeover of provinces, Afghan security forces laying down their arms, and President Ghani's abrupt departure from the country he led, watching 20 years of effort crumble in only a matter of days, has made it all the more clear that we could no longer occupy Afghanistan, and that the president's decision to bring our troops home was the right one. And for me, as I closing this chapter of the U.S.-Afghanistan book is a difficult one. I voted to authorize the war back in 2001, after the terrorist attack on September the 11th. In the 20 years since, I've seen how this conflict cost the lives of countless Americans, Afghans, and our NATO partners. And what makes this all the more difficult is this is a war that should have ended 19 years ago with a different outcome. But our hubris, our own desire to remake Afghanistan, our own willingness to negotiate got in the way of that victory. These are hard truths, but only by examining these hard truths will we be able to understand what went wrong in Afghanistan. The task before us on this committee, one that I'm committed to making, will explore the past 20 years. But we'll be talking to individuals from the Bush administration, from the Obama administration, from the Trump administration, as well as the Biden administration. And I now recognize Mr. McCall for his opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Secretary also for agreeing to stay until every member has been heard. I believe every member has a right to ask questions on such an important topic. Over the last several weeks, we witnessed Afghanistan rapidly fall to the Taliban and the chaotic aftermath that followed. This did not have to happen, but the president refused to listen to his own generals and the intelligence community, who warned him precisely what would happen when we withdrew. This was an unmitigated disaster of epic proportions. I never thought in my lifetime that I would see an unconditional surrender to the Taliban. For weeks, our offices were flooded with requests to help people get out of Afghanistan, requests that were coming to us because the State Department failed to provide help. And then the unimaginable happened. On August 26, 13 American servicemen and women were brutally murdered by ISIS-K trying to help American citizens and our Afghan partners escape from the Taliban. 2 days ago, we commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And while we mourn the loss of almost 3,000 innocent people, the Taliban at the same time celebrated by raising their flag over the presidential palace. Days before, they emblazoned their flag on the wall of our United States Embassy, proclaiming the defeat of the United States of America. Shockingly, the White House has described this Taliban regime as businesslike and professional. So let's meet a few of these professionals, the so-called new and improved Taliban. The acting Prime Minister, Mullah Hassan Akhund, one of the Taliban's founding leaders. He is also sanctioned by the United Nations and sheltered Osama bin Laden for years. The infamous members of the Taliban Five released from Guantanamo under the Obama administration also all hold senior positions in the new government. And finally, the worst, acting Interior Minister Haqqani. He is responsible for overseeing policing and counterterrorism. He's also wanted by the FBI. He is the head of the brutal Haqqani network with close ties to al-Qaeda and is currently sanctioned by the United States. Most of the new and improved Taliban leaders hold the same or similar positions they held prior to 9/11. And we are now at the mercy of the Taliban's reign of terror, all while a dark veil of Sharia law covers Afghanistan. The freedoms our troops help secure for Afghan women and girls have been stripped away in a matter of weeks. This, in my judgment, is not only disgraceful, it also dishonors the men and women who served our nation so bravely. Mr. Secretary, the American people don't like to lose, especially not to the terrorists. But that is exactly what has happened. This has emboldened the Taliban and our adversaries. The Taliban, a designated terrorist group, now equipped with American weapons than most countries in the world. Just a few weeks ago, thousands of terrorists, the worst of the worst, were all released from prisons as the Taliban overran the country. The situation we find ourselves in is far worse, in my judgment, as a former chairman of Homeland Security Committee, far worse than pre-9/11. To make matters worse, we abandoned Americans behind enemy lines. We left behind the interpreters who you, Mr. Secretary, and the President both promised to protect. I can summarize this in one word: betrayal. The America I know keeps its promises. The most important promise in our military is no man left behind, no one left behind. But you broke this promise. Unfortunately, it wasn't the only promise this administration broke. In April, President Biden promised, quote, "We will not conduct a hasty rush to the exit, and we will do it responsibly, deliberately, and safely." But that promise was broken. And then in July, the president said, quote, "There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of the United States Embassy in Afghanistan." That promise was also broken. Our standing on the world stage has been greatly diminished. Our enemies no longer fear us, and our allies no longer trust us. And our Afghan veterans are questioning if their sacrifice was worth it. For those veterans who are watching this today, I have a message for you. Your service was not in vain. It is because of your heroism that we have not witnessed a large-scale attack by the terrorists since 9/11 in the last 20 years. And for that, I say to all of you, thank you. And so we are here today to better understand how this administration got it so wrong. And I hope you will directly answer our questions, Mr. Secretary, succinctly, because we have quite a few. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now turn to the chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation, Ami Bera, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming before the subcommittee. Obviously, this is not going to be an easy hearing. There'll be a lot of questions back and forth. And we certainly, over the course of the next few months at the subcommittee and full committee level, will do some more oversight on the information and so forth that decisions were made on. I want to focus, though, on the mission that's still at hand. You know, my district has the largest Afghan refugee population in the country. We've submitted over 10,000 names of U.S. citizens, visa holders, family members, et cetera. And, you know, that mission still remains. I've got close to 30 school-age kids that are still in Afghanistan, U.S. citizens, visa holders, along with their parents. And we've got to do everything we can to get those folks to safety. And I look forward to working with you, your staff, and others to make sure we don't leave folks behind and we get those folks out as reasonably as possible to safety. And I look forward to the testimony. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Bera. I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, this administration's bungled pullout from Afghanistan just may be the worst foreign affairs disaster in American history. You've essentially surrendered that country and its people to the good graces of the Taliban, and the Taliban doesn't have good graces. Afghanistan is once again a haven for terrorists, and those terrorists now have our weapons and equipment to use against us. As Mr. McCall correctly stated, our allies may well not trust us as much, and our enemies may not fear us as much. Yes, the majority of the American people wanted to leave Afghanistan, but not like this. Pulling our troops out before civilians, abandoning Americans behind enemy lines, as well as thousands of Afghans who worked with us and fought with us and their families, and leaving half the population, about 20 million women and girls, to be brutalized once again by the Taliban. This is a disgrace. And I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Now I'll introduce our witness. Secretary of State Antony J. Blinken was sworn in as the United States Secretary of State on January 26, 2021. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, this will be the third time Secretary Blinken testified before this committee, and we are grateful for his appearance before us today. I'll now recognize the witness for his testimony, which I understand will be a little longer than 5 minutes, but being that he's going to be here for all of our questions, I think it's important for his statement to be heard in its entirety. Secretary Blinken, I now recognize you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, thank you for today. I welcome this opportunity to discuss our policy on Afghanistan, including where we are, how, and where we're going in the weeks and months ahead. For 20 years, Congress has conducted oversight and provided funding for the mission in Afghanistan. I know from my own time as a staff member for then Senator Biden how invaluable a partner Congress is. As I said when I was nominated, I believe strongly in Congress's traditional role as a partner in foreign policy making. I'm committed to working with you on the path forward in Afghanistan and to advance the interests of the American people. On this 20th anniversary of 9/11, as we honor the nearly 3,000 men, women, and children who lost their lives, we're reminded why we went to Afghanistan in the first place: to bring justice to those who attacked us and to ensure that it would not happen again. We achieved those objectives long ago. Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, a decade ago. Al-Qaeda's capabilities were degraded significantly, including its ability to plan and conduct external operations. After 20 years, 2,641 American lives lost, 20,000 injuries, $2 trillion spent, it was time to end America's longest war. When President Biden took office in January, he inherited an agreement that his predecessor had reached with the Taliban to remove all remaining forces from Afghanistan by May 1st of this year. As part of that agreement, the previous administration pressed the Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, including some top war commanders. Meanwhile, it reduced our own force presence to 2,500 troops. In return, the Taliban agreed to stop attacking U.S. and partner forces and to refrain from threatening Afghanistan's major cities. But the Taliban continued a relentless march on remote outposts, on checkpoints, on villages and districts, as well as the major roads connecting them. By January 2021, the Taliban was in the strongest military position it had been in since 9/11, and we had the smallest number of troops on the ground since 2001. As a result, upon taking office, President Biden immediately faced the choice between ending the war or escalating it. Had he not followed through on his predecessor's commitment, attacks on our forces and those of our allies would have resumed, and the Taliban's nationwide assaults on Afghanistan's major cities would have commenced. That would have required sending substantially more U.S. forces into Afghanistan to defend themselves and prevent a Taliban takeover, taking casualties, and with at best the prospect of restoring a stalemate and remaining stuck in Afghanistan under fire indefinitely. There's no evidence that staying longer would have made the Afghan security forces or the Afghan government any more resilient or self-sustaining. If 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in support, equipment, and training did not suffice, why would another year, another 5, another 10? Conversely, there is nothing that our strategic competitors, like China and Russia, or adversaries like Iran and North Korea, would have liked more than for the United States to re-up a 20-year war and remain bogged down in Afghanistan for another decade. In advance of the President's decision, I was in constant contact with our allies and partners to hear their views and factor them into our thinking. When the President announced the withdrawal, NATO immediately and unanimously embraced it. We all set together on the drawdown. Similarly, we were intensely focused on the safety of Americans in Afghanistan. In March, we began urging them to leave the country. In total, between March and August, we sent 19 specific messages with that warning and with offers to help, including financial assistance to pay for plane tickets. Despite this effort, at the time the evacuation began, there were still thousands of American citizens in Afghanistan, almost all of whom we evacuated by August 31st. Many were dual citizens living in Afghanistan for years, decades, generations. Deciding whether or not to leave the place they know as home was an incredibly wrenching decision. In April, we began drawing down our embassy, ordering non-essential personnel to depart. We also used this time to significantly speed up the processing of the special immigrant visas for Afghans who had worked for us and by our side these past 20 years. When we took office, we inherited a program with a 14-step process based on a statutory framework enacted by Congress and involving multiple government agencies, and a backlog of more than 17,000 SIV applicants. There had not been a single interview in the SIV program in Kabul for 9 months, going back to March of 2020. The program was basically in a stall. Within 2 weeks of taking office, we restarted the SIV interview process in Kabul. On February 4th, one of the very first executive orders issued by President Biden directed us to immediately review the SIV program, to identify causes of undue delay, and to find ways to process SIV applications more quickly. This spring, I directed significant additional resources to the program, expanding the team in Washington of people processing applications from 10 to 50, and doubling the number of SIV adjudicators at our embassy in Kabul. Even as many embassy personnel returned to the United States under order of departure, we sent more consular officers to Kabul to process SIV applications. As a result of these and other steps, including working with Congress, by May, we had reduced the average processing time for special immigrant visas by more than a year. Even amid a COVID surge at Embassy Kabul in June, we continued to issue visas. And we went from issuing about 100 special immigrant visas per week in March to more than 1,000 per week in August, when our evacuation and relocation efforts began. That emergency evacuation was sparked by the collapse of the Afghan security forces and government. Throughout the year, we were constantly assessing their staying power and considering multiple scenarios. Even the most pessimistic assessments did not predict that government forces in Kabul would collapse while U.S. forces remained. As General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said, nothing I or anyone else saw indicated a collapse of this army and this government in 11 days. Nonetheless, we planned and exercised a wide range of contingencies. Because of that planning, we were able to draw down our embassy and move our remaining personnel to the airport within 48 hours. And the military, placed on standby by President Biden, was able to secure the airport and start the evacuation within 72 hours. The evacuation itself was an extraordinary effort under the most difficult conditions imaginable by our diplomats, by our military, by our intelligence professionals. They worked around the clock to get American citizens, Afghans who helped us, citizens of our allies and partners, and at-risk Afghans on planes out of the country and off to the United States or to transit locations that our diplomats had arranged and negotiated in multiple countries. Our consular team worked 24/7 to reach out to Americans who could still be in the country, making in those couple of weeks 55,000 phone calls, sending 33,000 emails, and they're still at it. In the midst of this heroic effort, an ISIS-K attack killed 13 service members working the gates at H-Kaya, wounding 20 others, and killing and wounding scores of Afghans. These American service members gave their lives so that other lives could continue. In the end, we completed one of the biggest airlifts in history, with 124,000 people evacuated to safety. And on August 31st in Kabul, the military mission in Afghanistan officially ended, and a new diplomatic mission began. I want to acknowledge the more than 24 countries that have helped with the relocation effort. Some served as transit hubs, some welcoming Afghan evacuees for longer periods of time. And I want to recognize the extraordinary efforts by Congress as well. To name just a few examples, Congressman Fitzpatrick worked with the State Department to reunite an Afghan family in New Jersey. Congressman Keating worked with our folks on the ground to help a Voice of America reporter and his family get to the airport. Congresswoman Jacobs and Congressman Issa worked across party lines to draw attention to cases of legal permanent residence and Afghans at risk. Please know your emails, your calls made a real difference in getting people out, and we continue to use the lists and information you're providing in the next phase of the mission. Let me now just briefly outline what the State Department has done over the last couple of weeks and where we're going in the days and weeks ahead. First, we moved our diplomatic operations from Kabul to Doha, where our new Afghan affairs team is hard at work. Many of our key partners have joined us there. Second, we're continuing our relentless efforts to help any remaining Americans, as well as Afghans and citizens of allied and partner countries, leave Afghanistan if they so choose. This past Thursday, Qatar Airways charter flight with U.S. citizens and others on board departed Kabul and landed in Doha. On Friday, a second flight carrying U.S. citizens and others departed Afghanistan. These flights were the result of a coordinated effort by the United States, Qatar, and Turkey to reopen the airport and intense diplomacy to start the flights. In addition to those flights, a half dozen American citizens, about a dozen permanent residents of the United States have also left Afghanistan via an overland route with our help. We're in constant contact with American citizens still in Afghanistan who have told us that they wish to leave. Each has been assigned a case management team to offer specific guidance and instruction. Some declined to be on the first flights on Thursday and Friday for reasons including needing more time to make arrangements, wanting to remain with extended family for now, or medical issues that precluded traveling last week. We'll continue to help them, and we'll continue to help any American who still wants to leave, and Afghans to whom we have a special commitment. Just as we've done in other countries where we've evacuated our embassy, and hundreds or even thousands of Americans remain behind. For example, in Libya, in Syria, in Venezuela, in Yemen, in Somalia. There is no deadline for this mission. Third, we're focused on counterterrorism. Taliban is committed to prevent terrorist groups from using Afghanistan as a base for external operations that could threaten the United States or our allies, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K. We'll hold them accountable for that. That does not mean we will rely on them. We will remain vigilant in monitoring threats. We'll maintain robust counterterrorism capabilities in the region to neutralize those threats if necessary. And we do that in places around the world where we do not have military forces on the ground. Fourth, we continue our intensive diplomacy with allies and partners. We initiated a statement joined by more than half the world's countries, over 100 countries, as well as the United Nations Security Council resolution, setting out the international community's expectations of a Taliban-led government. We expect the Taliban to ensure freedom of travel, to make good on its commitments on counterterrorism, to uphold the basic rights of the Afghan people, including women, girls, and minorities, to name a broadly representative permanent government to forswear reprisals. The legitimacy and support the Taliban seeks from the international community will depend on its conduct. We've organized contact groups of key countries to ensure the international community continues to speak with one voice on Afghanistan and to leverage our combined influence. Last week, I led a ministerial meeting of 22 countries, NATO, the EU, the United Nations, to continue to align our efforts. And fifth, we'll continue to support humanitarian aid to the Afghan people. Consistent with sanctions, this aid will not flow through the government, but rather through independent organizations like NGOs and UN agencies. Just today, we announced that the United States is providing nearly $64 million in new humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan to meet critical health and nutrition needs, address the protection concerns of women, children, and minorities, to help more children, including girls, go back to school. This additional funding means the United States has provided nearly $330 million in assistance to the Afghan people this fiscal year. In Doha and Ramstein, I toured the facilities where Afghans that we evacuated are being processed before moving on to their next destinations. Here at home, I spent some time at the Dulles Expo Center, where more than 45,000 Afghans have been processed after arriving in the United States. It's remarkable to see what our diplomats, our military, and employees from other civilian agencies across the U.S. government have been able to achieve in a very short time. They've met an enormous human need. They've coordinated food, water, sanitation for thousands, tens of thousands of people. They're arranging medical care, including the delivery of babies. They're reuniting families who are separated and caring for unaccompanied minors. It's an extraordinary interagency effort and a powerful testament to the skill, the compassion, and the dedication of our people. We should all be proud of what they're doing. And as we've done throughout our history, Americans are now welcoming families from Afghanistan into our communities and helping them resettle as they start their new lives. That's something to be proud of as well. Thanks very much for listening. And with that, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for your testimony. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witness. I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. Please note that I will be strict in enforcing the 5-minute time limitation for questioner. What do I mean? I don't want members to ask questions for 5 minutes and then not leave the Secretary time to respond. So when addressing your questions, please keep in mind that the 5 minutes is for questions and answers. I'll start by recognizing myself. Mr. Secretary, you've mentioned in an area of concern that I know is shared by all is the status of American citizens, green card holders, and our SIV heroes who are yet to be evacuated. Can you tell us how many of them remain in the country, And what is our plan to facilitate their evacuation now?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as of the end of last week, we had about 100 American citizens in Afghanistan who had told us that they wished to leave the country. And I want to emphasize that this is a snapshot in time. It's more accurately a moving picture, as you know, stepping back for a minute. To know precisely at any given moment in time exactly how many American citizens are in any country is something we can't and don't know. Americans are not required to register when they go to a foreign country or if they reside there. And so from the start of this effort, we've been engaged in an intense effort to identify every American citizen that we could in Afghanistan, to be in touch with them, in contact with them, and to work with them if they wanted to leave. We've also benefited greatly from information provided by Congress to help us fill out this picture. But as of last week, there were about 100 who we were in contact with who continue to express an interest to leave. We offered seats on the planes that got out last week to about 60. 30 came forward and used those seats. What happens at any given moment is that people are making decisions hour by hour, if not day by day, about whether to leave or not. And as I said earlier, these are incredibly wrenching decisions because for the most part, this is a community of people who've been living, residing in Afghanistan for all their lives. Afghanistan is their home. They have extended families, and it's very, very hard for them, understandably, to make that decision. But that is the group that we're working with. Now, what also happens is, as people will identify themselves, including since the end of the evacuation, as American citizens in Afghanistan who wish to leave. So they get added to the picture. We get information from you, from NGOs, from other groups, veterans groups, about people purporting to be Americans in Afghanistan. We immediately seek to contact them, to engage with them, to find out if, in fact, they're in Afghanistan, and if, in fact, they want to leave. So this is a picture that will continue to change over time, but that is the rough population that we're working with right now.
Thank you. Let me ask, next question. I know that the Trump administration's deal with the Taliban meant that there were 2,500 troops remaining with less than 5 months to complete the withdrawal. At any time, did the Biden administration consider whether to renegotiate the deal with the Taliban?
The Taliban made abundantly clear in many public statements, private statements, to us, to others around the world, that it was going to hold us to the deadline that the previous administration negotiated in terms of withdrawing the remaining American forces. It made very clear that if we moved past that deadline, it would resume the attacks that it had stopped on our forces and on our allies and partners, as well as to commence the onslaught on the cities that we've seen in recent months. And so that was exactly the choice that President Biden faced, whether to go forward with the agreement and the commitments that his predecessor had made in terms of withdrawing all forces by May 1st, or return to war with the Taliban and escalate, not end the war. Now, Mr. Chairman, as you know, what the president did do was to take some risk in extending past May 1st the time we would use to actually withdraw our forces so that we could do it in the safest and most orderly way possible.
Let me try to get in one more
he
question.
extended that deadline until September.
So also, we know that there was appointed recently in the government hardliners in the new Taliban group. Taliban's commitments to share power with other Afghan political and social groups excludes women and minorities. How does the appointment of this new government factor into the administration's strategy to engage with the Taliban, or assumptions that the Taliban may have changed?
So the interim government named by the Taliban falls very short of the mark that was set by the international community for inclusivity, that is to have a government that was broadly representative of the Afghan people, not just the Taliban and its constituency, to include women, which this interim government does not, and as has been noted, it includes many key members who have very challenging track records. We've been very clear that when it comes to engaging with that government or any government to be named on a more permanent basis, we're going to do so on the basis of whether or not it advances our interests. And those interests are very clear. They're the expectations that we've set and the international community has set for the ongoing freedom of travel, for a government that makes good on the Taliban's commitments to combat terrorism, not allow Afghanistan to be used as a haven for launching attacks directed against other countries, to support the basic rights of the Afghan people, including women and minorities, and to allow humanitarian assistance to get to people who so desperately need it. That will be the basis upon which we engage any Taliban-led government, whether it's this interim government or one they may name in the days and weeks ahead.
I now yield for questions to the Ranking Member McCall.
Thanks, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in the weeks before the fall of Kabul, the surrender to the Taliban, I was on the phone with very high-ranking officials at State, DOD, White House, trying to save lives. We had Americans that couldn't get out. We had interpreters that couldn't get through the perimeter of the Taliban. They are left behind. They will be executed. They do have a bullseye on their back. We had 4 buses of Afghan girls, orphans, at the American University School of Music that sat there for 17 hours when I was finally told the State Department would not lift the gate to let them in to safety, even though they had an aircraft waiting. Will you guarantee to this committee, now we are at the mercy of the Taliban, though, can you guarantee to this committee that we will get them out?
First, Ranking Member McCall, thank you for every effort that you made, as well as other members of this committee made, to help people in need, to try to help them get out. Those are deeply appreciated, and going forward, we continue to look to them. Now, I have men and women in my department, the State Department, who raised their hands from around the world and ran into the building. They went from posts around the world into that airport to help people get out. They were serving at the gates right alongside our brothers and sisters in uniform, including the 13 who gave their lives, literally trying to pull people in as necessary, or to walk them in, to talk them in, to do everything they possibly could to bring American citizens, to bring Afghans at risk, to bring the nationals of our partners and others into the airport.
If I could reclaim my time, it's just limited. And we thank.
No, it's important, sir, for you to recognize.
We thank the service.
Well, you did.
We also thank the service, and we also thank the service of people like that worked in Operation Pineapple in Dunkirk. I would ask that the State Department work with them. Those are heroes as well as the State Department officials that you're talking about. My last question, very important. Bagram went down, the embassy went down, and we went dark. We have no eyes and ears on the ground. We've lost intelligence capability in the region. That includes Russia, China, and Iran, as you know. This is a national security threat as China moves in. For all I know, they may take over Bagram Air Base. But this over-the-horizon capability, I believe, is exaggerated. It's not a viable option. It's too far away. Did you negotiate with countries like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan to put an ISR capability there? And my last question is it true that President Putin threatened the President of the United States, saying he could not build intelligence capabilities in the region?
This is an important question, and one that in its detail and substance I think we need to take up in another setting for reasons I know that you very much appreciate. Let me just say this very broadly, and you know this very well given your focus and expertise on these issues. The terrorist threat has metastasized dramatically over the last 20 years, and it's most acute in places like Yemen, like Libya, like Iraq, like Syria, like Somalia. And of course, we have much greater and different capabilities than we had 20 years ago in terms of dealing with that threat. And in many countries around the world, we deal with it effectively with no U.S. boots on the ground. We lost some capacity for sure in not having those boots on the ground in Afghanistan, but we have ways, and we are very actively working on that, to make up for that, to mitigate for that, to make sure that we have eyes on the problem, to see if it reemerges in Afghanistan, and to do something about it. But what I would propose,
and if I could reclaim,
we have this
sir,
conversation.
I would like to work with you, because if we can't see what's happening on the ground, we can't see the threat, we can't respond to it, the threat's only going to grow, it's going to get worse, not better, and we have to have that capability. Let me ask you one last question. We had these planes grounded at Mazar-e-Sharif, and the Taliban seems to be holding these planes up. What are you currently negotiating with the Taliban with respect to these Americans that are trying to get out on these planes? And also, are you negotiating with the Taliban on the issue of legitimizing them as a real government?
Not only us, but virtually the entire international community, including in a United Nations Security Council resolution, has made clear what we expect and will insist on from the Taliban if they want to seek any legitimacy or any support. And that includes, it starts with freedom of travel. So we've been intensely engaged with Turkey and Qatar to get the airport in Kabul up and running again, which is now the case. And we started to get flights out last week with American citizens on board. And with regard to Mazar-e-Sharif, you're correct. There have been charter flights there that have been there for some time that have not been allowed to leave. We want to see those flights leave. We need to see a process put in place to allow those flights to start to move. And we're working on that every day.
Thank you. Now yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, we've requested such a classified briefing not too long ago, and we welcome your assurance to schedule this briefing sometime in the immediate future.
Yes, absolutely.
I now recognize Representative Brad Sherman from California for 5 minutes.
Secretary Blinken, thank you for reminding us that Americans were not required to register if they were in Afghanistan, and I hope my colleagues will support my legislation to require Americans to register if they go to a war zone. The ranking member says that he never thought he'd see an unconditional surrender of the United States to the Taliban. He saw it in 2020 when President Donald Trump announced that we'd be out by May 1st of 2021, forced the release of 5,000 of the Taliban's best fighters, and most importantly, created a circumstance where there was not even a credible possibility that we would engage in force to support the Afghan government. There are those who say we should get out all of our Afghan allies and all those who face oppression or death from the Taliban. I would point out that the Afghan army, together with all of its veterans over 20 years, together with all their families, you're talking about millions of people. And while the Taliban may be harsh to the girls who are music students who are orphans, imagine how harsh they'll be to a girl whose father was in the Afghan army trying to kill the Taliban. When the administration took over, the American people made it clear we had to get out in 2021. The Afghan government, some thought, had some chance to fight to a stalemate. But by spring, those closest to us, those most in the know, were demanding visas to get out, to flee as quickly as possible. They weren't asking for guns to build trenches around Kabul to fight the Taliban. They were asking for visas. They were demanding visas. They were making videos about how they were going to be killed. When they started to flee, that started a stampede, and there is simply no way the administration could have an orderly or successful stampede. And it seems absurd, at least in retrospect, to think that the average Afghan grunt would fight in the trenches while seeing those who were best connected desperate to flee in a matter of days. Secretary Blinken, when you came into office on January 20th, we were committed to pulling everyone out of Afghanistan within 3 months, by May 1st. Did the Trump administration leave on your desk a pile of notebooks as to exactly how to carry out that plan? Did we have a list of which Afghans we were going to evacuate? Did we have a plan to get Americans from all over Afghanistan to Kabul and out in an orderly way? How meticulous was the planning for the Trump administration declared May 1st withdrawal?
Thank you, Congressman. We inherited a deadline. We did not inherit a plan.
So no plan at all. It's amazing that it wasn't much worse. It was controversial when we gave up 5 Taliban for Bergdahl, not the most meritorious of American fighting men. But the Trump administration gave 5,000 of the Taliban's top fighters back to the Taliban. What did we get for that, other than empty promises that were broken?
Congressman, the deal that the previous administration struck involved, as you rightly said, committing to remove all U.S. forces from Afghanistan by May 1st of this year. And in addition, as that deal was being negotiated and then put into effect, pressing the Afghan government to release these 5,000 prisoners, many of whom went back to the battlefield. And at the same time, in return, getting from the Taliban a few commitments. One, not to attack our forces or allied and partner forces during the time of the agreement, from the time it was reached until May 1st, when we were supposed to pull out all of our forces, as well as not to go at the major cities, and to take steps to ensure that Afghanistan would not be used by Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group.
So, Secretary, I've got one more question. You're criticized for not getting our weapons out. Our weapons were given to the Afghan military. They were all over the country. Was there a way to disarm the Afghan government without being seen by the world as betraying the Afghan government? And was there a way without casualties to go all over Afghanistan and grab the trucks and the tanks, et cetera?
Simply put, no. Of course, a lot of excess equipment was handed over to the Afghan security and defense forces, partners that we had worked with for 20 years, supported, financed, and equipped for 20 years to take on some of that equipment. And of course, when those forces collapsed in the space of about 11 days, some of that equipment wound up in the hands of the successor forces, the Taliban. Our folks worked very hard to disable or dismantle equipment that we still controlled before we left Afghanistan. And what we see now is much of the equipment that was left behind, including in the hands of the Afghan forces that then fell to the Taliban, much of it, based on what I understand from my colleagues at DOD, is inoperable or soon will become inoperable because it has to be maintained. It's not of any great strategic value in terms of threatening us or threatening any of Afghanistan's neighbors, but it does give the Taliban, as we've seen in pictures, all of us, uniforms and guns and some other equipment that is now in their hands.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you testified that you had encouraged Americans to leave the country. But, simultaneous with that was statements being made, including by President Biden, that Afghans' military capability was 300,000 men strong, and that they had the best training imaginable. So, at best, I would say they were misled. And you don't mention withdrawal conditions that were placed by President Trump on any exodus from Afghanistan. But I do have a couple of questions I'd like to ask. Did you concur and support President Biden's July 23rd phone call telling President Ghani to be untruthful about the Taliban's success? According to Reuters, which reviewed both the transcript and the audio, President Biden said, quote, "And there's a need, whether it be true or not, there is a need to project a different picture." Was that an ad lib by President Biden, or was that lie scripted into the phone call? And if it was scripted, by who? Secondly, have any Americans been arrested, beaten, abducted, or killed by the Taliban or ISIS-K since we left? And do we have the capacity and the capability to know that? Third, were there any gaps or weaknesses in the vetting process of Afghan evacuees, especially in light of the fact that reliable information on some, perhaps many, who got parole wasn't available to conduct a meaningful background check? Are you concerned that the Taliban may have embedded its members as evacuees? I visited our base at Fort Dix recently, with some of the other members of Congress and our governor, and asked a number of questions. But I was very concerned about the vetting, or lack thereof, and the fact that parolees, about 70% strong at our base at least, and we're going to go up to about 13,000, they can leave if they would like. They're free to leave. It's not clear whether or not they can return, but they are free to leave. And finally, one of the profoundly negative consequences outside of Afghanistan has been China and Taiwan. The state-controlled Chinese Communist Party media, including CCP-run Global Times, and I read it every day, are saturating the Taiwanese with messages to give up and surrender to Beijing because the United States will, just as it did in Afghanistan, abandon them too. That's what the Global Times is saying. But if you could start off with the first question, I would appreciate it, and go through them.
Thanks very much, Congressman. Let me see if I can address all those questions. First, with regard to the phone call you cited, I'm obviously not going to comment on purportedly leaked transcripts of phone calls. Here's what I can tell you. What the President said in that conversation with then President Ghani is exactly what he was saying in public. And it's this, that the issue was not the capacity at that point of the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces to hold the country and to hold Kabul. It was their will and whether they had a plan to do so. And we were concerned that they were not demonstrating that will or that plan. He pressed President Ghani on the need to consolidate his forces based on the military advice from our military leaders to make sure that he could defend the places that needed defending and not overstretch those forces. And he needed to bring people together.
I understand that, but my question is about the truthfulness.
That's what he said.
I only got a few minutes. Whether or not it's true or not.
If I can.
Was it a real, is the transcript untrue?
Again, I'm not commenting on any purportedly leaked transcripts. I'm telling you what, based on my knowledge of the conversation the President said, and what he said is exactly what he said in public. Second, with regard to American citizens remaining behind, the ones we're in contact with, we have 500 people on a task force and teams dedicated to them to be in regular contact with them. And I have not heard from those people that concern raised. I can't say whether there are any American citizens who are not in contact with or don't know of who may have been mistreated in some fashion in Afghanistan. Third, with regard to the background checks, and this is very important, and you're right to focus on it. As you know, before Afghans evacuated from Afghanistan reach the United States, they go to a transit country, and that's where the initial checks are done. We've surged Customs and Border Patrol. We've surged our intelligence and law enforcement capacity to do those initial checks. And then when they get to the United States, first at a military base, those checks are continued using all of law enforcement, intelligence, security agencies to do that, so that we can make sure that we are not letting anyone into the country who could pose a threat or a risk. It's exactly that balance that's so important as well in the SIV program. We all want to bring Afghans at risk into the United States. We also have an obligation that you rightly point out to the security of our fellow citizens. Finally, on China and Taiwan, as I said earlier, whatever protestations they may be making in newspapers or in their propaganda, there is nothing that China would have liked more than for us to have re-upped the war in Afghanistan and to remain bogged down for another 5, 10, or 20 years. That would have been profoundly against our strategic interests and profoundly in China's strategic interests. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Albio Sires of New Jersey, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, Civilian Security, Migration, and International Economic Policy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us for the third time. And I want to also say thank you to the work that the State Department has done in getting people, including 11 members of one family that were all united and are here now in this country. So my hat is tipped off to those people who work so hard. The question that I have is, the Taliban seems to be having a complete hold in the country. But I understand there are other groups in Afghanistan. How fragile or how strong, firm is the Taliban's hold on this country? And do you see that breaking apart as everybody wants their piece down the line? Because it seems that this country is made up of pieces of people that control certain pieces of the country.
It's thank you. It's a very good question and an important one, and it is very hard to predict with any certainty. The country is, in so many ways, as you pointed out, fractured among different groups, different ethnic groups, north, south, east, and west, different outside actors that may be supporting one group or another. And so, for the Taliban to fully consolidate control, I think that remains an open question. It's also why, ironically, it would be profoundly in the Taliban's interest to actually put forward a genuinely inclusive and representative government, because to the extent it doesn't, to the extent that everyone other than the Taliban is left out, that's only likely to, at some period in time, whether it's tomorrow, next week, next year, or thereafter, cause those who are left out to try to assert one way or another their rights and needs. So all of that, I think, is an open question at this point. One last thing I'd mention. The country itself is in desperate straits. The UN estimates that fully half the population is in need of humanitarian assistance. We have severe malnutrition, health problems, COVID-19, droughts, etc. And so there, too, the Taliban has a big problem on its hands. And, of course, it is generating very, very little revenue in order to deal with that. All of which, I might add, gives the international community very significant leverage and influence going forward.
I also read where they're running out of food in the next few months.
Yep, that's correct. We've seen a terrible drought, growing nutrition problems. It's one of the reasons that we think it's so important to make sure that, regardless of anything else, we and other countries find ways to continue humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan. We've committed additional funds to do that. There's a pledging conference called by the United Nations that's ongoing, and we can and will do that consistent with the sanctions, consistent with our laws, by directing assistance through NGOs, through the United Nations agencies, not through the government. We need to do everything we can to make sure the people of Afghanistan don't suffer any more than is already the case.
I would like to see if we're going to help Afghanistan with food and aid, that we extract certain commitments from them before we just give them food. And the
Thank
last
you.
thing I wanted,
Go ahead.
and the last thing I want
Please.
to say, I want to commend the country of Colombia. I think they've taken thousands of Afghanistans and they're vetting them before they get here. Is that accurate?
There are a number of countries around the world that have made those commitments, that are either serving as transit countries or serving as resettlement countries, taking in Afghans as refugees. And we deeply appreciate the countries that have stood up and agreed to do that.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions, Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Greg Meeks, and I'm glad to join with our dear colleague Albio Osiris in thanking our great ally of Colombia of helping the Afghan refugees. Sir, in my service on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Global Terrorism Subcommittee, the Armed Services Committee, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and the Helsinki Commission, I've always been impressed by American Foreign Service diplomats worldwide. Their dedication to service is inspiring. That is why I am shocked at your actions superseding military advice, leading to the surrender in Afghanistan to be a safe haven for murderous terrorists. Biden and Harris have also opened the southern border, stopping the wall of President Donald Trump. This allows identified terrorists of the terror watch list to enter American neighborhoods as lone wolf suicide bombers to murder as many Americans as possible. In American history, American families have never been at a greater risk of attack at home than today. As the global war on terrorism is not over, it has been moved from abroad to American homes. As the grateful father of an Afghanistan veteran, I especially see your actions as indefensible. With 12 visits by me across Afghanistan to thank the South Carolina Army National Guard troops, the 218th Brigade, commanded by General Bob Livingston, I know firsthand they appreciated serving with their Afghan brothers. I saw the United States Agency for International Development success in building schools, agricultural projects, hospitals, and bridges and roads. My beliefs have been actually expressed by the New York Post editorial board on September the 1st, and that is, quote, 6 lies Joe Biden told about Afghanistan. How can any American believe anything Biden says after he's lied so blatantly? Lie. If there are American citizens left, we're going to stay until we get them out. Truth. Biden himself admits Americans remain stranded in Afghanistan. Lie. We're making the same commitment Biden said to Afghanistans who assisted America. Truth. A senior State Department official confessed to NBC News that the majority of Afghans didn't make it out of Kabul. Lie. The United States stands by its commitment that we've made to vulnerable Afghans, such as women leaders and journalists. Truth. Team Biden didn't even ensure American employed journalists made it to safety. Lie. Asked by a reporter, do you see any parallels between what happened in Vietnam? None whatsoever. Zero. Truth. Not even a month later, pictures came from Kabul of a helicopter flying over the American embassy. Lie. Biden vowed to continue to provide Afghan army with air support. Truth. In the wake of Biden's withdrawal decision, he pulled the air support intelligence and contractors. The Afghan militaries couldn't operate. Lie. July 8th. Biden added that the likelihood there's going to be a Taliban overrunning everything is highly unlikely. Truth. In fact, Biden knew the Taliban were overtaking the Afghan government and asked President Ghani to lie about it, whether it's true or not. Sadly, the advanced military equipment left to the terrorists, and I end the quote of that article. Sadly, the advanced military equipment left to the terrorists is comparable to all of the military equipment that we've provided to Israel since 1948. The countries who have suffered most from Islamic extremist terrorist attacks, India, Israel, and America, are endangered. They chant death to Israel, death to America. We must never forget the May 8th bombing in Kabul, where Islamic extremist terrorists slaughtered over 80 innocent young girls. You should have changed course then because of this gruesome, revealing fact. The murderers of that attack now will have a safe haven to attack American families at home. Your bizarre abandoning of Bagram airfield led directly to 13 Marines murdered in Kabul. You should resign. I yield back.
Mr. Secretary, we only had 43 seconds left of the 5 minutes, so your response, I know you will not be able to answer many of the questions that was put forward by Representative Wilson, but if you choose, you have 43 seconds of which to respond for whichever questions were asked to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me simply thank the member for his support for the men and women of the State Department. I appreciated that part of the statement. Thank you.
I now recognize Representative Jerry Connolly of Virginia, who's the president of the NATO Parliamentarian Assembly, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I guess I would say to my friend from South Carolina, if I were the member of Congress who committed one of the most grievous acts in a State of the Union address when the President of the United States, Mr. Obama, was our guest, to shout out, "You lie," I might take more care about enumerating other alleged lies in a hearing with the Secretary of State. Mr. Secretary, what we're listening to on the other side of the aisle, sadly, is sort of a salad mix of selective facts and a lot of amnesia in the salad dressing. The history of instability in Afghanistan didn't begin on August 14th of this year, did it?
It did not.
Am I correct in remembering that, in fact, you could trace direct routes to 1977, 1978, when there was a communist coup and the president of Afghanistan was assassinated in the presidential palace? Is that correct?
It is.
And 1 year later, the Soviet Union, because of that instability, decided to invade Afghanistan. Is that correct?
It is.
And 10 years later, the Soviets left Afghanistan because they had mounting and maybe really unsustainable military casualties and felt that they were engaged in a process that could not be won. Is that correct?
It is.
And meanwhile, because the United States decided once that happened, it would disengage primarily from Afghanistan, groups like the Taliban had 12 years in which to create political power. Is that correct?
It is.
And in 2001, we re-entered Afghanistan in response to the tragedy we just remembered, 20-year remembrance this week, and we rolled up the Taliban by making alliances with various militia groups in the north and moved south until they lost control of the country in that year in 2001. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And the purpose of our involvement was to defeat al-Qaeda because the Taliban were harboring this virulent terrorist group that had attacked America. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would it be fair to say that we achieved that objective?
It would.
Would it be fair to say that, in fact, 10 years later, the leader of that group who masterminded the attacks of 9/11 was, in fact, killed by a United States specially trained military unit?
That's correct.
So what happened ultimately on August 14th has lots of history. I know it's convenient to pretend that didn't happen. And I know that we want to give ourselves sort of the pleasure of attacking a political leader of the other party. And so let me engage in that too. I'm going to assert that the events of August 14th had their direct antecedent with a bad decision by President Trump and Secretary Pompeo in 2018 to elevate and legitimize the Taliban in Doha, Qatar, by agreeing to have face-to-face negotiations. That tragedy was compounded exponentially by an unbelievable decision to exclude the government of Afghanistan, ostensibly we were defending, from those very negotiations. Is that an accurate statement, Mr. Secretary?
Certainly that's what we inherited.
But the Afghan government was in fact excluded from the negotiating table in Doha by the Trump administration. Is that not correct?
That's essentially correct, yes.
And when those 5,000 people were released from prison, since the ranking member is so concerned, and correctly so, about 2 Haqqani members in the current cabinet of the Taliban, were there any known terrorists or declared terrorists by the United States among those 5,000 people released with the consent and negotiated agreement of the Trump administration?
Almost certainly, yes.
I guess our concern about terrorists is pretty selective and limited to partisanship. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. I now recognize Representative Steve Shabbat of Ohio, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On August 16th, Mr. Secretary, President Biden said that the administration had considered every contingency and was executing the evacuation according to your plan. Was it part of your plan to rely on the Taliban to ensure the safety of Americans trying to flee the country? Because that's what happened.
We, through the course of the spring and summer, did indeed, as the President said, look at every contingency for dealing with our drawdown. And
we relied upon the Taliban to be our security. In essence, we ended up getting 13 of our military personnel and over 150 Afghan civilians killed by relying upon the Taliban. They didn't provide very good security. We never should have relied upon them. Let me move on my second question.
We were not relying upon the Taliban. As you know, what happened was the Afghan security forces and the government collapsed within the space of 11 days. We then executed the plans that we had in place to safely draw down our embassy, move it to the airport. The military came in, took over the airport, and started getting evacuation flights out within 72 hours. Those were the plans that were in place.
We certainly relied upon it at the airport. It didn't work out so well. Mr. Secretary, President Biden has laid the blame for the evacuation debacle in Afghanistan on others rather than on himself, where it really belongs. He blamed President Trump, as we've discussed already to some degree here, basically claiming that he was just following Trump's policy. But he hasn't hesitated to disregard every other major Trump policy, our southern border, the Keystone Pipeline, the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran deal, Mexico City policy, and on and on. Yet this was the one Trump policy that he had to follow. Do you understand why this is pretty hard to fathom for a lot of people?
I think what's perhaps, Congressman, hard to fathom or people just don't understand is that the agreement reached by the previous administration required all U.S. forces to be out of Afghanistan by May 1st. In return, the Taliban stopped attacking our forces, our partners, and it didn't commence an onslaught of the Afghanistan cities. Had the president not followed through on the commitments that his predecessor made, those attacks would have resumed. We would have re-upped the war in Afghanistan after 20 years for another 5, 10, or 20 years. We would have had to send more forces back in. And I recognize that a lot of people don't understand that, don't know the agreement that was reached, and the choice that President Biden faced for May 1st.
Let me ask you this. When he wasn't blaming Trump, he was blaming the Afghan military forces for allegedly not being willing to fight. But whereas we had suffered a single U.S. military death in a year and a half, and that's a wonderful thing, the Afghan military forces had lost about 3,000 of their military personnel during that same time. So wasn't the president being a little unfair to those 3,000 Afghans who lost their lives fighting the Taliban during that period of time?
Congressman, many Afghan soldiers fought with incredible bravery and gave their lives. You're right. But as an institution, after 20 years of investment by the United States, by the international community, hundreds of billions of dollars, equipment, support, training, as an institution, it collapsed in 11 days.
Mr. Secretary, we went into Afghanistan in the first place because the Taliban had harbored al-Qaeda, correct? And they attacked us on September 11th. Now, 20 years later, we have the Taliban back in charge there, and they have billions and billions of dollars worth of our equipment and our weaponry. And once again, they're a haven for terrorists. How is this not a debacle of monumental proportions?
Congressman, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, the al-Qaeda, the group that attacked us on 9/11, long ago was vastly degraded to the point where it is currently not capable in the assessment of our intelligence agencies of conducting an externally directed attack against us or against others. The Taliban should remember as well what happened the last time it did, as you rightly said, harbor al-Qaeda, and it engaged in an outwardly directed attack against us. It knows the consequences of continuing to do that, and it has made commitments not to allow that to happen. But of course, we're not relying on those commitments. As we discussed a little bit earlier, we are putting in place what we do in countries around the world where we don't have boots on the ground, which is an over-the-horizon capacity to detect the reemergence, should it happen, of any threat, including from al-Qaeda, and the means to do something about it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ted Deutsch of Florida, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you being here today. And we do need to look back. This is a really important hearing, but we also need to look forward. The reality is we have a Taliban government. We have terrorist groups already surging. Potential threats to U.S. interests remain. It is true that we are not the world's policeman, but we know that a strengthened ISIS-K or al-Qaeda pose a threat not only to the U.S. homeland, but to Americans abroad, our interests abroad, and the region. The Middle East and North Africa in particular were fundamentally changed in the aftermath of 9/11 with the rise of al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates. We clearly can't trust the Taliban to keep terrorists at bay. So, Mr. Secretary, you traveled to Doha to conduct diplomatic talks with partners and allies on our continued counterterrorism role. What do you assess to be the operational capacities of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? And how is the administration planning to hold the Taliban to its commitment to ensure that al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups are unable to use Afghan soil to plan terrorist attacks on or threaten the security of the U.S. and our allies?
Thank you very much. A few things on this. First, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, as you know from your focus on this, the terrorist threat has metastasized significantly from 9/11, and it is much more acute now in terms of potential threats to the homeland and threats beyond the countries in question from Somalia, from Yemen, from Libya, Iraq, Syria, a number of other countries in Africa as well. And so we have to be able to make sure that we're focused everywhere. That's a possibility, and resourced appropriately. And we are. And in a number of those places, as you know very well, we don't have boots on the ground, but we find ways to deal with that threat, including with over-the-horizon capabilities. In the case of Afghanistan, a couple of things. The current assessment of the intelligence community is that long ago, al-Qaeda was so significantly degraded that it's not in a position to conduct externally directed attacks. But we will remain hyper-vigilant about any reemergence of that threat. And we will be working closely with partners and other countries to be in a position to do that. I think the chairman referenced earlier that we hope and expect in the near future to be able to do some classified briefings on this, because there are a number of things that it would not be appropriate to discuss in this setting.
Thank you, Secretary, and we appreciate your commitment to ensuring that those classified briefings occur. Secretary Blinken, the war in Afghanistan was the first mission in the history of NATO arising out of the invocation of Article 5. There are over 50 NATO members and partner countries sent troops. 36, it's been reported, had troops there at the time of the drawdown. They invested political capital, our allies invested political capital and funds and certainly troops. And often those troops gave their lives as well. The criticism that we've heard from some of our allies is that there was not adequate consultation and coordination with our NATO allies. We heard the Secretary General of NATO say just this week that there was. Others doubted that. I'd like you to speak to that. But finally this, we had an administration, Mr. Secretary, that wanted to go it alone, a president who failed to appreciate and often criticized the importance of NATO allies while embracing Xi and Putin. If you could also, in their final time with me, speak to, at a time when democratic values are being threatened and at risk in so many places around the world, if you could also speak to the importance of that transatlantic relationship and how to reassure those allies of ours who have raised concerns about how we went about pulling out of Afghanistan and about failing to coordinate with them as we did.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of things. First, you're so right to point to our allies and partners who stood with us on 9/11 and in all the days and time thereafter. And you're exactly right that Article 5 of NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all, in essence, was invoked for the very first time in its history in our defense by our allies and partners, something that I will never forget, and I suspect no one on this video conference today will ever forget. And we determined that when it came to Afghanistan, we went in together and we would go out together. And that's exactly what we did. I engaged with the Secretary of Defense in intense consultations with our NATO partners well before the President made his decision, going to Brussels for a special session of the North Atlantic Council and listening intently to every single partner, relaying what we heard directly to President Biden to factor that into our thinking and into our planning. I've spent more time in Brussels either in person or virtually, than in any other place since I've been on this job, working very closely with these allies and partners. On the day that the president's decision was announced, I was back in Brussels with the Secretary of Defense, and NATO immediately and unanimously endorsed that decision. Now, in the discussions and conversations that we had throughout this time, including individual conversations, people brought various perspectives to the table, but each recognized that given the deadline that existed, that is, that our forces had to depart Afghanistan by May 1st, pursuant to the agreement negotiated by the previous administration, that the alternative, should we choose to stay, was for the Taliban to resume attacks, not just on us, but on our NATO partners and allies, as well as to engage in this countrywide offensive that we've seen to retake the major cities, in effect, to re-up the war. And all unanimously endorsed the proposition that we would leave together, and that's exactly what we worked on doing, what we've been doing. I know from talking to many allies and partners the tremendous solidarity we saw together at the Kabul airport, working to help each other to make sure that we could get out our fellow nationals, Afghans who had helped each of us, and our embassy personnel. I heard a lot of gratitude from allies and partners about the work that our folks did in making sure that we could deliver on that commitment to them. So from my perspective, at least, there was tremendous and genuine consultation with allies and partners throughout this process. And going forward, right now, we are deeply engaged with them at NATO and in other organizations on working together on the way forward to collectively hold the Taliban to the commitments that it's made to the international community.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blinken, assuming it's not classified, can you tell us where you are today?
Yes, I'm at the State Department.
Oh, couldn't be bothered to come down here and see Congress. All right, that's great.
Hey, sir, excuse me, sir. My understanding is that the House is not in session, and that's why the session has been.
I'm right here, Secretary. So is the chairman. So is the ranking member. We're here, Mr. Chairman. Reclaiming my time. Did state at any point in the evacuation process block American citizens from leaving Afghanistan?
No, we did not.
None. Your testimony before Congress is that state didn't block any American citizens leaving Afghanistan.
To the contrary, my officers, men and women, ran into the building from around the world to help Americans get out.
It's a simple yes or no. I heard you do it with Mr. Connolly. You can do it with me. Yes or no? I just want to clarify. You didn't block anybody. State didn't block any American citizens.
No. Okay. They were there to help Americans get out.
How many Afghans not meeting the qualifications of SIV have been brought to the United States? Prior to, I want to know how many Afghan citizens came to the United States that had not met the qualifications for special immigrant visa.
We're in the process of
No. How
going
many?
through.
How many? How many did you bring? You were just at Dulles. How many did you bring?
We will have, by the end of the month, we will have brought a total of approximately 60,000
that have not met the SIV process.
Some of those will have been through the SIV process. All of them, regardless of SIV status, will have gone through rigorous security checks. First at the transit points outside of the United States.
It'd be nice if that was done before we brought these people to the United States of America. Mr. Secretary, are Afghan refugees required to be vaccinated for COVID before coming to the United States of America?
They are vaccinated in the United States before they are resettled into the United States.
There are none of these Afghan citizens that are allowed to leave these resettlement communities, Fort Dix, Dulles, et cetera, that are allowed to leave at any time they want. None of them are leaving unless they are vaccinated for COVID. Is that your testimony?
They're tested for COVID and vaccinated for COVID.
Vaccinated before they leave?
That's my understanding.
All right, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Is it the policy of the United States of America to take hard-earned tax dollars and pay terrorist organizations?
It is not.
It is not. So your testimony earlier is that we're sending taxpayer dollars to Afghanistan right now for humanitarian relief. Who are we sending that to?
To NGOs and to the United Nations agencies who are using that assistance, not to the Afghan government.
Not to the Afghan, the Taliban government. How are you accounting for that? How are you making sure that the Taliban government is not receiving that?
As we do around the world in places of conflict where we provide humanitarian assistance, working through UN, working through NGOs with long-tested methods to make sure that the assistance provided goes to the people who need it, not to the government in question.
Is it your understanding that over the past 20 years, the United States taxpayers have paid Pakistan, who has then used that money to support the Taliban, the Haqqani Network, ISIS-K, Khorasan Group, et cetera, for the past 20 years? Is that not true?
There's a long history that we should all look at together about the involvement of Pakistan.
So I would say that we should no longer pay Pakistan and we should pay India. Let me ask you this. I just have a couple more questions for you. A little off topic here, but I think it's interesting. How long was your recent interview with the FBI, and was it a deposition?
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're referring.
Are you saying that you have not had a recent interview with the FBI since becoming Secretary of State?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, and I'm happy to take that up with you offline.
Did the State Department turn over documents to the FBI related to Hunter Biden, Burisma, and or the Blue State Strategies Corporation?
You'll have to.
So you have no knowledge of this. You have had no. You don't. Are you saying you have not had an interview with the FBI since becoming Secretary of State?
It would not be appropriate for me to comment in a public forum on any legal proceedings that the department.
I'm not asking you to cooperate. I'm not asking you to comment on the legal proceedings. I'm just asking if you've been interviewed by the FBI since becoming Secretary of State.
Again, I'm not going to comment one way or another on any legal proceedings or not that may or may not have happened.
Have you sought to...
Let me remind the gentleman that the topic of this hearing is Afghanistan. That's what we're...
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, but the Secretary generally refuses to answer questions about Afghanistan, so I just figured we'd talk about something he should be intimately familiar with. Have you sought to alter any of your testimony from last year's Senate investigation regarding this topic? Mr. Secretary.
Gentleman's time has expired. And let me also, for the record, make clear that this is a hybrid hearing. Just as members had an option to come or to be other places, the Secretary also. It's a hybrid hearing because we are not in session.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, point of inquiry, if I could.
Who seeks recognition?
This is Congressman Issa. Just for my edification, was it expressed to the Secretary that he had a choice of either one, or was he invited to come here, or was he alerted to remain there? And I only ask because I think we all agree that if he could have been here in person, it would have been better. But if it was an option or for whatever reason, because I want to make sure that it's clear that the Secretary may have done no wrong, even though many of us would prefer him to be here.
The Secretary has done no wrong. It was an option, and I made it as an option as I've done with every member.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Representative Karen Bass of California, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for attending this hearing and for your patience with putting up with the theatrics of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I want to thank you again for spending the time and agreeing to take everyone's questions for 5 minutes. The departure from Afghanistan has provided really unprecedented insight into our foreign policy. In addition to demonstrating the bravery, dedication, and professionalism of our military, diplomats, and Afghan partners, it has also shown how a 20-year effort and billions of dollars have really raised questions about what the return of investment is that we desired in terms of sustaining peace and stability in Afghanistan. The assumption of power by the Taliban has secondary and tertiary effects on the most vulnerable segments of the population, especially women and children. And we're concerned that it will reverse any gains that were realized in the last 2 decades. So my first question, yes or no, Mr. Secretary, did the agreement from the last administration include any protections for girls and women?
Not to my knowledge.
So many people are concerned about the status of women and girls in Afghanistan under the Taliban. The restrictions on education, movement, health, physical safety under their regime paints a grim picture. I'd like to know how the administration will work with partners to support advocacy for women's rights and the rights of ethnic and religious minorities in Afghanistan. Here's what I found. Go ahead.
Thank you, Congresswoman. One of the truly great achievements of the last 20 years was the progress made by women and girls in particular in Afghanistan. And one of the things that we should be proud of is the support, the leading support that we gave to that when it comes to access to education, to health care, to the workforce, entrepreneurship. Those gains were significant, and we were the leading contributor. I was in Kabul in April. I sat with a number of women who had benefited from our assistance, including women who'd gone on to become leaders in their parliament, in the media, NGOs, et cetera, and of course heard their profound concerns about the future. Just recently, when I was in Doha and at Ramstein, talking to people who'd been evacuated from Afghanistan, I spoke to a lot of women and girls and heard their deep concerns about the future, as well as people who are still in Afghanistan. And so we have an ongoing commitment to use every tool at our disposal through our diplomacy, through our economic assistance, humanitarian assistance, programmatic assistance, to do whatever we can to continue in coordination with many other countries to support women and girls and minorities in Afghanistan. The assistance that we announced today will go in that direction. The assistance we'll provide going forward will do that. And with regard to women and girls in particular, given the incredible fragility of the situation that they're now in, I will be naming a senior official here at the State Department to focus entirely on the ongoing effort, both from the United States government and in coordination with other countries, to support them.
Well, thank you very much. And so will the administration expand the license to operate humanitarian programs in Afghanistan? And how will that take place? And which partners do you see us continuing to work with?
In short, yes, that's exactly what we're looking at. And you rightly point out we've already issued a license to make sure that humanitarian assistance could go forward. We're looking at whether that needs to be expanded, consistent, of course, with our sanctions and consistent with our national security, to allow appropriate assistance to get to those who need it.
Who approves that license? Who are we making that request to?
The Treasury Department is responsible for the licenses, but we do this in coordination or consultation with us and other agencies in the government, as well as, of course, the White House.
And which partners on the ground are we continuing to work with?
We have, and we can get you the list. We have a number of NGOs that remain active in Afghanistan, as well as
NGOs or NGOs.
Some are. There are, I believe, a couple of U.S. NGOs that are still active, international NGOs, and UN agencies. I met with the head of the UN's humanitarian assistance program just a few days ago when I was in Doha, and we spent a lot of time talking about how this assistance could continue to go forward and what some of the mechanisms were that could be put in place to make sure that it was getting to the right people and being used effectively.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Darrell Issa from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, before we get into the tougher part of this, I want to thank you for the effort that has gone on by the men and women of both the State Department and the Department of Defense, and a lot of independent actions that occurred to try to help get people out in the aftermath of the withdrawal. I would not be doing my job, though, if I didn't ask some tough questions. One of them is up here on this board, and it's pretty straightforward. A response I received from the State Department said to my staff when we asked about continued work to get people out, it said, make contingency plans to leave when it is safe to do so. That do not rely on U.S. government assistance. How do we square the fact that in an official response that I waited weeks for, that we do not have any assurance for assistance, but that when people get out, typically they are lauded by the State Department as success stories? That includes an 80-year-old couple that was announced to have gotten out when in fact We saw no real assistance by the State Department, had to find out there was a non-government flight and get these 2 American citizens onto that flight, and we still have a number of others. So in a nutshell, how do I explain don't rely on the United States? Do we or do we not rely on the United States of America for blue passport holder American citizens who want to get out?
The answer to that is yes, absolutely. And could you tell me, because I'm sorry, I can't see it clearly from here, when and to whom that statement was made?
We'll give it to your staff so that you get it without it being fully disclosed, but it is a correspondence
and
directly.
Congressman, I'd really welcome following up with you, with your team, with your staff to make sure that we are following up on that particular request. I've got here, because I really want to express deep appreciation to members of Congress, this committee. I have here a very lengthy document of all of the inquiries that we've received from HVAC, from members of HVAC on people who've come to you seeking assistance, all of which has been factored into our databases, our information, our efforts. But if someone is not getting the response they need, please come back to us and let me know, and we'd be very happy to work with you on that. Thank you.
We'll do that. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Now, if I can quickly go through a few dates and a few statements. On July 8th, President Biden was asked if he listened to the intelligence assessment that the Afghan government was likely to collapse. He answered, "That is not true. They are not. They did not reach that conclusion." In other words, the IC hadn't reached that conclusion. I believe that we'll find that as of July 8th, the President misspoke. The President also said the likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely. 2 days later, on July 10th, the Taliban was reported to have 85% of the country. Then on August 12th, the Wall Street Journal reported that on July 13th, you received an urgent dissent memo from 23 U.S. Embassy personnel in Kabul warning that the advances of the Taliban and the rapid collapse of Afghanistan. Your spokesman said you read every memo sent to you from the dissent channel. So if you do, then you knew that, in fact, a major portion of people in the embassy believed that they were going to quickly overrun. On August 18th, President Biden said the intelligence community did not say back in June or July that, in fact, this was going to collapse like it did. But the embassy told you, or at least a great many, in July that it would. The question really is, how do we regain confidence in the State Department and its spokespeople, yourself included, and the President, if, in fact, we cannot square what we receive, members of Congress, both publicly and privately, that indicate some of those statements that I just read, including ones by the President, are not supported by the facts?
Thank you. As you know from tracking this as well, throughout the year, assessments were made of the resilience of the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces, and the possibility of the Taliban taking over the country. And this was typically done in a series of different scenarios, worst, mid-case, best-case scenarios. In the worst-case scenarios throughout the spring, I think it's fair to say that the general assessment was that the government and security forces would be able to hold on to the country well into next year, 2022. At some point in July, there was an assessment that it was more likely than not that that time frame was down to the end of the year. And then, of course, as things fully unraveled in August, that changed. To my knowledge, Congressman, no one predicted the unraveling before our forces and embassy left Afghanistan on August 31st. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, has said nothing I or anyone else saw indicated a collapse of the government and the security forces in 11 days. The Director of National Intelligence has said in the days leading up to the Taliban takeover, intelligence agencies did not say collapse was imminent. This unfolded more quickly than we anticipated, including in the intelligence community. And there are a number of other conclusory statements of that kind that I can share with you. With regard to the so-called descent channel cable, it's something I'm immensely proud of. It's a tradition that we have, and you're right. I read every such cable. I respond to it. I factor it into my own thinking and actions. And that cable did not predict the collapse of the government or security forces before our departure. It was very focused and rightly focused on the work we were doing to try to get Afghans at risk out of the country and pressing to speed up that effort. As it happens, a number of the things that were suggested in that very important cable were things that we were in the process of doing. The very next day, I think the cable came in on the 13th of July. The 14th, we launched Operation Allies Refuge, which of course had been in train for some time, as well as the 24/7 task force to help those in the SIV program get out and even to relocate them, which is not part of the program. So that was a very important cable. I'm grateful for it and grateful that we have a process at the State Department where people can clearly express their views and differences on policy or recommendations on policy. That's usually important.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Bill Keating of Massachusetts, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy, the Environment, and Cyber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service. And as head of the Department of State for our country, I want to thank all of your people for the work they've done. They stood side by side with our military, risking their lives in helping people evacuate in the most dangerous situation. So my sincere appreciation to everyone at State that was part of that. I'm also glad that you reinforced, as my conversations have, the renewed commitment, the strength that is there with our transatlantic allies going forward on our mission, not just in the region, but also through worldwide through our counterterrorism efforts. So I must say this, though. This is a period of reassessment, I think, as we go forward, where we have some lessons learned, where we go embarking on a new mission, where we're trying to do the best in that area and so many fronts. But there's one relationship that really is always troubled me a great deal, certainly over the last couple of decades, and that's our relationship with Pakistan. You know, from its Pakistan's played an active and, by so many accounts, a negative role in Afghan affairs for decades, not just recently, but for decades. From the very beginning, its inception, they helped in actually branding the name Taliban. And by 2005, when the Taliban was reconstituting in East and South Afghanistan, and importantly across the border in Pakistan, and as Pakistan's ISI, their Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, had such strong ties and cooperation with the Haqqani network, responsible for so many things, including the deaths of some of our soldiers. And even recently, when the Taliban took over in the last month, Pakistan's Prime Minister Khan, claimed that Afghanistan had, quote unquote, broken the shackles of slavery. So we used to always hear diplomatically that we have a complicated relationship with with Pakistan. I would say it's often duplicitous. So as we go forward in the region, as we go forward dealing with our counterterrorism missions, how do we reassess that relationship? How have we learned from their actions? And when we go forward, what do we do? What are some of the big issues that we should have, stakes in the ground, that we should have in dealing with Pakistan and the way they've acted over these decades?
Thank you, Congressman, and I think you're very right to point at the role that Pakistan has played throughout the past 20 years and even before. And it is one that has involved hedging its bets constantly about the future of Afghanistan. It's one that's involved harboring members of the Taliban, including the Haqqanis. It's one that's also involved at different points cooperation with us on counterterrorism. And so there are a number of things that have come into play. It has a multiplicity of interest, some that are in conflict, clear conflict with ours. When it comes to Afghanistan, it's focused, of course, as well on India and the role that India is playing in Afghanistan, and it looks at it through that prism as well. All of these things, I think, have influenced what it has done on many occasions detrimental to our interests, on other occasions in support of those interests. And so going forward, what we are looking at, what we have to look at, is an insistence that every country, to include Pakistan, make good on the expectations that the international community has of what is required of a Taliban-led government if it's to receive any legitimacy of any kind or any support going forward, to include ensuring freedom of travel, to include making good on its commitments on not allowing Afghanistan to be used as a haven for outward-directed terrorism, to include upholding the basic rights of the Afghan people, including women and girls and minorities, to include allowing humanitarian assistance in, to include having a more representative government. And so Pakistan needs to line up with the rest of the, with a broad majority of the international community in working toward those ends and in upholding those expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'd like to
Gentleman's time has expired.
At another time, and thank you for your work with the U.S. Agency for Global Media. We'll continue to work on that front and many others. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Adam Kinzinger of Illinois for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here and spending this time. It's very important. You know, watching some of this debate, I think it's important to remind people, yes, the Trump administration failed in the setup, and I think the Biden administration absolutely failed in the execution of this. I also want to make it clear, Mr. Secretary, we support the members of the State Department and their heroic action in the evacuation. I think the broader point is they never should have been put in a place where they had to act heroically. We found ourselves many times, we talk about Bagram and leaving that, and I think that's important to point out. But there was also moments where the U.S. military, with the 6,000 people that we sent in, could have defended Kabul proper. It was clear that the Taliban were not intending to move into Kabul as early as they did. But we put them in a position where they had to act heroically. And we shouldn't ask that of our State Department employees, even though we appreciate that they did. I also think it's important to point out, you know, there's a lot of blame of the Afghan military. And I certainly, as a military man myself, wish that the Afghan military would have helped. But keep in mind, prior to that, there were assessments coming out that it was only a matter of time. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year, until the whole place collapsed. You know, we had built a military in our own image that relied on air power, that relied on logistics. And then we pulled our logistic and air power support from the Afghan military. And as they received night letters from the Taliban saying, we're going to kill your family because the United States is vacating, they're leaving you. It's, to me, as much as I would love for them to have stayed and taken a stand heroically, I don't know many even of our allies' militaries that frankly could have stood in those conditions in that kind of an onslaught. Let me ask you, though, Mr. Secretary, you know, you talk a little about the Taliban legitimacy, and we're going to see how they act. I want to ask you a question, because I'm not sure where that changed. At the beginning of all of this, we were talking about building a worldwide coalition to not recognize the Taliban. And all of a sudden, this is on the table. Is the Taliban the legitimate government of Afghanistan? And if not, would you consider what the Taliban have done in Afghanistan to be a coup d'etat?
First, let me just start by thanking you for your strong words in support of the men and women of the State Department. I very much appreciate them and appreciate you saying them. Second, with regard to the Taliban and your question, it is the de facto government of Afghanistan. Those are just the facts. And
I don't mean to interrupt, but I need to. Has there been any discussion of an Afghan government in exile, vice president, even if the president had left? Is there any discussion of that? Because this, to me, appears to be an armed military coup against the legitimate elected government of Afghanistan.
Congressman, we'll certainly look to see what the lawyers say. From where I sit, this is the product, alas, of one side getting the upper hand in a civil war.
Let me ask a couple of questions here on something too about that. So if we look at the list of new key players in the regime, we have the current prime minister who was deputy during the 9/11 attacks, the current deputy prime minister who served as number 2 defense official during the 9/11 attacks, the current foreign minister who's your counterpart was the minister of culture and information during the 9/11 attacks. And we have designated terrorists in key positions like those that are responsible for preventing Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven and terror once again. So we look at that list and we see those individuals who not only defended al-Qaeda, but have committed crimes against women and vulnerable populations. And I think anybody would look at that and say, this is the same regime that failed to hand over Osama bin Laden 20 years ago. But let me just ask you, have these individuals committed to denouncing al-Qaeda, to denouncing the Haqqani network, and ensuring that they will execute any attacks against them should they try to organize in their territory?
Well, in the agreement that was secured by the previous administration, the Taliban, now represented by these individuals, made commitments not to allow Afghanistan to be used as a launching ground for externally directed terrorism, whether by al-Qaeda or by anyone else. The big question now, and you're right to point to it, is whether they will make good on that commitment. But of course, we can't and won't rely on them to do that, even as we insist that they do.
Let me ask you too. Thank you, and I'm sorry to cut you off. Just
no, please go ahead.
Quick points. Number one, we absolutely have to be executing any attack against al-Qaeda that we can, where we see them form. And secondarily, because I'm running out of time, let me stress to you the importance of State Department working hand in hand in a public and private way with these NGOs made up of former veterans that are doing stuff that unfortunately the government can no longer do. And let me encourage you to give them top cover and work with them to provide the assets necessary to get these people out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I yield back.
Let me just say I really appreciate you saying that and putting the spotlight on that, because veterans groups are doing remarkable work. We're in close contact with them. I met with about 75 veterans organizations and groups virtually about a week ago. We followed up with a number of other meetings, and we deeply appreciate the work that many veterans on this committee, as well as organizations, are doing, and we're looking to work even more closely together on that. Thank you.
Good news.
I now recognize Representative David Cicilline of Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You explained that you inherited an agreement with a deadline but no plan, a backlog of 17,000 special immigrant visas, and a responsibility to evacuate safely both Americans and those who helped us in this effort. As a candidate, President Biden promised to end the war in Afghanistan, and he kept his word. I agree with him. It was the right thing to do. And while today's hearing is focused on the U.S. withdrawal, I think it would be a mistake to lose sight of the misjudgments and lessons learned over the long arc of the past 20 years, and I hope Congress will have an opportunity to do its own self-reflection. But I want to begin, Mr. Secretary, my question about the evacuation. You were cut off when you were trying to explain the vetting process, and I wonder if you could quickly finish that answer about what the State Department did with respect to vetting people that were being evacuated out of Afghanistan.
Sure. And two things, and by the way, I very much agree with you, and I heard the chairman say at the outset that this committee, among other things, will be focusing on the 20-year history of our engagement in Afghanistan, and I think there are lots of lessons to be learned across the board through every administration, including our own. With regard to the vetting, two things I would point out here. First, we've spent a lot of time talking about the Special Immigrant Visa Program and our commitment, and the commitment I know of so many members of this committee, to the Afghans who worked with us, who stood side by side with us, and the work that we did these first months of the administration to take a program that was in pretty much a dead stall and to put it into
Mr. Secretary, I don't want to be impolite, but if you could just quickly say what you did, because I know how thorough it was. Yeah. I have two more things
sure.
I want to get to.
Thank you. Simply put, when it comes to vetting people coming out of Afghanistan, they go to transit countries. We negotiated agreements with more than a dozen countries to transit Afghans at those countries, and we do security screenings there. We've sent Customs and Border Patrol agents to all of those countries. We have the law enforcement, intelligence, and security agencies all there doing vetting, biometrics, biographic information. Then they come to the United States, but before they're resettled anywhere, They're also at one of our military bases, and any vetting continues there. And under authorities that we've asked Congress for, including the ability for people who are resettled in a year's time to apply for a green card, the vetting and background authorities will continue so that if anything comes up, we can continue to do that.
Great, thank you. As you know, Mr. Secretary, the LGBTQI community in Afghanistan is extremely vulnerable to punitive actions from the Taliban. It's important, in my view, that we take steps to ensure that those who would be subjected to violence or worse because of their sexual orientation or gender identity are safe. The Council for Global Equality, the Human Rights Campaign, and LGBTQI+ refugee support groups released a 10-point plan to protect Afghan LGBTQI refugees. My question is, have you seen this plan? And if so, is the administration prepared to implement it? And is it consistent with the presidential memorandum of early 2021 that speaks of the responsibility to help Afghan refugees that make it to neighboring states as outlined in that memorandum?
Well, thank you for very rightly putting the spotlight on concerns about the LGBTQI+ community in Afghanistan and the particular threat that they may find themselves under. This is something that we are focused on. I have not personally seen the report that you referred to. I'm going to ask to see it. I'm pretty sure that my team has, but I'll take a look at that myself, and I thank you for sending it to us.
Great, and I look forward to following up with you on that. And finally, Mr. Secretary, the Brown University Cost of War Project has compiled a sobering list of figures as it relates to post-9/11 conflicts, including Afghanistan. Trillions of dollars spent, over 900,000 lives lost in Afghanistan, 2,641 Americans, and 38 million people displaced around the world. And, Mr. Secretary, the war in Afghanistan went on, as you know, for 20 years, leading to extraordinary costs in terms of dollars spent, lives lost, and political capital expended. Taking stock of these costs, my question is, what do you think are the most important lessons after 20 years in Afghanistan and 20 years of post-9/11 conflict that we should learn?
I think all of us have to come together to do just that, to try to look at the lessons and then reflect those lessons in what we do together going forward. To my mind, at least, one of the lessons is while we are very effective at dealing with terrorist threats to our country and eliminating them, which we did very successfully in Afghanistan, the idea of using military force to try to remake a society is something that is beyond our means and beyond our capacity. And we need to think really hard about whether we want to engage in these enterprises going forward. You're right to point to the cost. Let me just say very quickly, I think that Brown study concluded that on the basis of about $2 trillion being spent on Afghanistan over the last 20 years, when you include indirect costs, that averages out to $300 million a day for 20 years. And I know people will say, well, that wasn't the case the last year or so, but had we not ended the war and brought our people home, we would have had to have re-upped it to deal with the renewed attacks by the Taliban, to deal with the onslaught nationwide. And those costs would have gone right back up again. And we have to ask ourselves very hard questions about whether that is the right way to spend our money.
Thank you. Gentleman's
Thank
time
you,
is
Mr.
expired. I now recognize Representative Lee Zeldin of New York for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, one of my colleagues claimed earlier in this hearing that the last administration's agreement with the Taliban was unconditional. That was false. In fact, you, sir, actually started to outline some of those conditions, and you were stopped. To recap, Mr. Secretary, the last administration's agreement with the Taliban was conditions-based, correct?
The conditions that you refer to included a commitment not to allow Afghanistan to harbor outwardly directed terrorists. It had very loose, let me just be clear, though, to respond to your question.
I know you listed it earlier, but the question is, it was a conditions-based agreement, correct?
Yes, except that those conditions were so loose, particularly with regard to the commitments it made.
You can criticize the agreement all you want, Mr. Secretary. I just wanted you to answer the question. Next, are you aware that President Biden says in the transcript of his George Stephanopoulos interview that he would have withdrawn from Afghanistan regardless of that prior agreement?
Yes, that's right. Okay. But not necessarily in the time, place, and manner that we did, which was imposed upon us by that agreement.
On July 8th, as Congressman Issa referred to earlier in this hearing, President Biden said, quote, "The likelihood that there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely." That is a very different prediction than what the U.S. intelligence community actually was saying. Mr. Secretary, where did the president get the highly unlikely intelligence estimate from?
As the intelligence community has actually said, including in the days leading up to the Taliban takeover, they were not, and no one was predicting the rapid collapse of the government and the security forces. Throughout the year, the intelligence community looked at a range of scenarios, worst case to best case, about the durability, resilience of the government security forces. In the springtime, it was anticipated to be.
The question is, where did the president get highly unlikely from?
Again, based on what the intelligence community was saying and the military. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs has said that no one anticipated that the government or the security forces would collapse in 11 days. Nothing he suggested.
Mr. Secretary, it would be good, though, if you were giving answers that were consistent with the answers that we were getting behind a closed-door briefing that we had with you and others. What is the number of Americans who are in Afghanistan as of the last update you received?
The Congressman, going back to this weekend, we had about 100 American citizens in contact with us who seek to leave Afghanistan. Those are the Americans we're working with.
Do you have an exact number?
I can't give you an exact number. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. It's really a snapshot at any given moment, because what happens is.
I asked you as of the last update you received.
Yeah, as of the last update, it was about 100.
Okay, how many green card holders?
Green card holders is something that we don't track directly. So what we've done is we've solicited people, if they are green card holders, to let us know. I think the best estimates are that there's several thousand green card holders in Afghanistan.
How many SIV applicants?
SIV applicants, those are numbers that we're working on right now as people come out of Afghanistan, some of them in the United States already, others at these transit points. We're collecting all of that information. The overwhelming majority of Afghans who've come out are Afghans who are at risk in one way or another. Some of them will be SIVs, applicants. Others will be people who are eligible for refugee visas. Still others will be at risk in some fashion. We are putting all those numbers together, and we should have that in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, this was fatally flawed, poorly executed. We had the loss of U.S. service members as a result. We should not have been operating off of an arbitrary July 31st deadline. Instead, what we should have done was tell the Taliban that we are going to leave Afghanistan when we're done bringing every last American home, not operating off of some arbitrary date. We shouldn't have collapsed Bagram when we did. We shouldn't have been relying on the Taliban to provide security at the airport. We shouldn't have been allowing billions of dollars worth of U.S. weapons and equipment to get turned over to Afghanistan. The administration should not have been lying and misleading the American public, like when the White House press secretary is standing out there to the press and to the American public and saying that Americans aren't stranded, even though we all know that they are. And I'm concerned that this administration, with incompetency, is exposing a vulnerability that other countries, like we see North Korea now testing long-range missiles. We see Iran enhancing uranium enrichment. What happens when China and Russia and Hamas and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they continue to press forward because we have an administration that doesn't know how to confront an adversary, understanding that they do not respect weakness, they only respect strength. And it is so greatly unfortunate, the consequences, and I believe that you, sir, should resign. That would be leadership. I yield back.
To the contrary, Congressman, I believe that there's nothing that our strategic competitors like China or Russia or our adversaries like Iran, like North Korea, would have liked more than for President Biden to have re-upped the war in Afghanistan for another 5, 10, or 20 years, to be bogged down in that conflict. Nothing they would have liked more. And we're now able, as a result of the decision the president made, that none of his predecessors made, to end the war after 20 years, to ensure that a third generation of Americans didn't have to go off and fight and die in Afghanistan, while bringing 125,000 people out. We are now in a much better position to confront the challenges and threats that we actually face in 2021.
This isn't a
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ami Bera of California, the chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, once again, I want to reiterate our thanks as a committee for your appearing before us, answering all the questions, and giving every member a chance. That is not something your predecessor did very easily. Look, I agree with President Biden's decision to withdraw. I think most of the American public agrees with that decision. I sat in many hearings, sat in many classified and open briefings as we were looking at various scenarios of what that withdrawal looks like, what the capabilities of the Afghan government were. And, unfortunately, the worst case scenario played out. And, the images that we saw coming out of Afghanistan were painful, frankly, in the last few weeks of August. And I do think the men and women in the military and State Department in difficult circumstances stepped up. I do think the logistics of that airlift and getting the numbers of American citizens, visa holders, SIVs, vulnerable Afghans out in such a short period of time was remarkable. I think we all mourn the loss of life of Afghan civilians, but also the 13 men and women that were serving our country and meeting the mission. And there will be time to kind of go through and do the oversight and get a sense of where did our estimates go wrong? Where were the flaws? But at this moment in time, knowing that we still have American citizens there, knowing that we still have vulnerable Afghans and so forth, I really do want our focus to be getting those folks to safety, the visa holders, the SIVs, and others. And I won't ask you to guarantee a commitment that you'll get everyone out. Nobody can make that promise. But what I will ask is working with my office, working with the various congressional offices, the men and women at the State Department, that we will use every resource that we can in a difficult situation, in a challenging security situation on the ground, to do the best job possible to get every American citizen, visa holder, SIV, and vulnerable Afghan out to safety. Can I get that promise that we'll do?
Absolutely. You have that commitment, and I welcome working with every member of this committee to do just that.
Great. Thank you. And your staff, and again, the men and women within the State Department and elsewhere, again, in trying circumstances, have been very readily available to work with us. Again, we've submitted over 10,000 names of folks, just given the size of our population in the community. Secondly, and we haven't talked about this, is, as I mentioned earlier, we have the largest Afghan refugee population in the country, and we're proud of that. We've welcomed these men and women. We've got great resettlement agencies that are working with folks, but we've also got real challenges just because of the rapidity of folks leaving country and arriving after being vetted in the United States. Many of these folks now are coming as humanitarian parolees under a visa status that doesn't necessarily have the resources that are available. I know we will be working on a budget supplemental to help provide the resources to get medical resources, get visa resources, and ramp up your staffing at the State Department to process these refugees. I would hope that the men and women on this committee, Democrat, Republican, as well as everyone in the House and Senate, overwhelmingly support the supplemental requests that will be coming as hopefully within the next few weeks to provide those resources. Because the one thing, when I talk to our veterans community, and many that are served in Afghanistan and are wondering about that service, the one thing we can do to make them whole is to welcome these folks that serve them, work side by side, often save their lives, and really do everything we can to get those folks to safety. Those that are coming to the United States, to help them reassemble their lives. So, Mr. Secretary, I would imagine that supplemental is coming. We've already heard some top line numbers the president's asked for. Are there specifics that, from your vantage point with the men and women who work for you, that you see on that horizon?
Yeah, thank you so much for flagging that. Let me just say very quickly, yes, we're going to be looking for support from all of you on this, and particularly a few things. For Afghans who are paroled into the United States to receive the same benefits that refugees do, so that they have some ongoing support, the ability to work in the United States, HHS benefits that they wouldn't otherwise get. We'd also like them to be able to apply for a green card after 1 year of being in the United States. And there's some significant funds that will be requested to support both the efforts that we've already made at the different transit points where we've incurred significant expenses, as well as to continue to relocate people, to bring them to transit points into the United States, process them, et cetera. So that is coming, and in fact, we need to get this done quickly in the CR, I think, so we have just a few weeks to do it, and I really welcome your support and everyone's support for that. Thank you.
I now recognize Representative Ann Wagner of Missouri, who's the vice-ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Secretary Blinken, I represent the people of Missouri's 2nd Congressional District, and today I'm also here on behalf of the family of Lance Corporal Jared Schmitz of our region. Let me tell you about this heroic and selfless young man. Lance Corporal Schmitz from Wentzville, Missouri, was 20 years old when he lost his life